Good afternoon and welcome to Day 2 of the ALCTS Virtual Symposium, Turn Your Idea into a Publication. I'm Mary Miller, Chair of the ALCTS Publications Committee, and I'll be your host for this afternoon's session entitled Writing for Publication. Our presenters today are Norm Medeiros and Kelly Jensen. Norm Medeiros is Associate Librarian for Collection Management and Metadata Services at Haverford College and is President-elect of ALCTS. He is published and presented in a variety of areas and is a former book review editor for library resources and technical services. Along with Haverford economist Richard Ball, Norm has recently awarded an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation grant for Project TIER, that's T-I-E-R, a protocol that teaches transparency and reproducibility in undergraduate empirical research. Norm's most recent publication, A Hard DDA's Night, Managing a Consortial Demand-Driven Acquisitions Program for eBooks, appears in Carl Bridges' volume, Customer-Based Collection Development, an Overview, which was published by ALA Editions in 2014. Our second speaker, Kelly Jensen, is a former teen and youth services librarian turned associate editor and community manager for BookRiot.com. When she's not writing there, she's blogging about young adult fiction, reading, and serving teens at stackedbooks.org. She's the author of It Happens, a guide to contemporary realistic fiction for the YA reader from Boya Press, and has had her writing published in Boya, School Library Journal, The Horn Book Magazine, Huffington Post, Blog Her, and more. In the first part of this session, Norm will share techniques for getting started with writing for publication and for working with collaborators. He will also discuss copyright considerations for authors, as well as considerations for research data transparency. In the second part of this session, Kelly will share techniques for organizing writing for publication, analyzing research data, finding time to write, and transitioning from writing for a blog to writing for a traditional publication. Before we get started, a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. Today's webinar does not have interactive chat capabilities. If you wish to comment on today's presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtags you see on the screen, but we will not be monitoring the Twitter feed. If you have questions for Norm and Kelly, please type them in the question box on your screen, and they will answer them as time permits at the end of the presentation. If there are questions that remain unanswered while we're on the air, those questions will be answered offline and the responses will be sent to the attendees. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation, and an evaluation within 2 days. Please take time to fill out the evaluation form since it will be used by the committee to plan future events. And there will be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Norm now.
Okay, well, thank you, Mary, and welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be part of today's session, so thanks for having me. Before we get started, I've asked my colleague Julia to make available to those in attendance a set of questions, 3 very brief questions, which will help us gauge your experience with publishing. So I'm going to ask Julia to go ahead and make those polls available, and if you could just complete them, that would be really helpful. Okay, so it looks like the final results are coming in now for the last question. This is really helpful to know. There seems to be a lot more publication experience in the audience than I may have expected, which is great. Hopefully some of the suggestions that I had will still be useful, and not surprisingly, there's a vast majority of attendees who maintain or contribute to blogs, so that's really great. I'm going to go right into my presentation now. So before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about myself, and particularly my background. When I was an undergraduate, I was a technical writing major, so I was preparing to devote my career to writing manuals on how to operate a VCR and assemble IKEA furniture, really stimulating stuff. That curriculum, though, really taught me to be concise and precise in my writing. When I ended up going to library school after graduation, my writing background continued to serve me well. And not just writing for publication, but in drafting policies and other local documents. My training continues to influence my writing style. Since I enjoyed writing, I pitched ideas for articles to editors when I became a professional librarian, but it wasn't for about 5 years until I was able to get my first article published. You know, they say that you never forget your first time, and believe me, I remember the first time I had my article published and to see my name in print. It was pretty cool. I was on a tenure track at the time, so it was sort of forced upon me, but you know, I'm not on a tenure track now, and I would have written anyway. So, you know, but that writing background was very helpful in orienting me to, particularly to try to put the word to the thing, as they say. Number one rule of thumb is no matter why you're writing, whether it's to build your professional portfolio for promotion and tenure, to make a name for yourself in the profession, or because you want to contribute to the literature, perhaps all of the above, you want to make sure your idea passes the so what test. I've served as a reviewer for a few library journals over the years, and I can't tell you how frustrating it is to read a piece that is unimaginative and for which no one will take an interest. Just because you have survey results doesn't mean you have a publishable idea. So ask yourself, who will care about this topic? If your answer is limited to family members, come up with a better idea. If submitting a manuscript to a peer-reviewed journal seems daunting, get your feet wet writing a book review or summary of a conference. And it seems like many of you have already done that. I published 2 reviews before my first article was published. It gave me experience working with an editor and crafting my writing style. There are ample opportunities to contribute to the literature in this way, and doing so will demonstrate that you are a capable writer and can meet deadlines. When I was the LERTS book review editor, I sought reviewers who were to publish.
Norm, your screen's not showing.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right, I'm sorry, guys. Thank you for that. I apologize. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Still not sure. Okay, so let's see. So I am showing my screen, and I'm not sure why it's not showing. Okay, we're going to switch over to another copy of my slide deck. Okay, it looks like we're back in business. I apologize for that glitch, but I'm getting some confirmation from my colleagues that we're back in business here, so I apologize. Let me just get right back to it here. So as I was saying, when I was Alerts book review editor, I sought reviewers who were eager to publish, but who were not quite ready to produce a research paper. So I'd like to think that the opportunities that I gave those individuals provided confidence for them to go to the next level. As I mentioned earlier, the toughest paper to publish is your first one, so lowering the barrier to a level that helps you be successful is a good idea. Okay, a few tips and techniques. Start with an outline. I know this sounds like something your junior high English teacher told you, but it really can help get your thoughts in order. The outline can also serve as a time management tool, which is something I'll talk about in a few minutes. Be clear on your methodology and think about how best to express your results. For instance, if you have focus group interviews, how will you weave these qualitative narratives into your paper? Likewise, if you have quantitative data such as survey results, how will you present these in a way that's logical and clear? Charts can be an effective means of expressing findings, but sometimes a simple table of descriptive statistics is more explicit. Don't overlook this important consideration, as you don't want your results lost on the reader. Tie in previous research effectively. I think too often writers think of the lit review section of a paper as just a mere compulsory task. Effective writers understand that this section should convey how the current paper is informed, extends, or differs from previous research. It helps to reinforce the hook, the answer to the so what question. Stay on track. Let your outline be your guide. Set dates by which you want to have drafts of the various sections completed. Chunking the paper will make the entire undertaking seem less daunting. Find a suitable place to work. When I was starting out, I always worked on the weekends in my apartment at the dining room table, where I had good light and ample space to spread out articles I was referencing. It's important that you find a similar focus. Just today, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, there was an article about a gentleman who talked about this very thing. His favorite place to work is McDonald's. For him, it had the right ratio of peace and quiet in terms of background noise, and he was a big fan of their French fries. So, find that place where you can focus. If you have a particular journal in mind in which you want to submit a manuscript, review its author guidelines and some of the recently published papers. Doing so will help you understand the author requirements and give you a sense of the journal's style. Submitting a manuscript that adheres to both will help your chances and endear you to the editor. Ask a trusted colleague to review your draft. I can't overstate how valuable this can be. Select someone with a proven track record in publishing who is supportive of you, but who will also be honest about the pluses and drawbacks of your work. Such a colleague can suggest ways of improving your work before you submit it. Relatively new writers have a difficult time maintaining objectivity. Your trusted reader can help provide such perspective. If you only read one book to help improve your writing, it should be The Elements of Style. The little book, first written by Cornell professor William Strunk, and then added to several years later by his student, E.B. White. I read this book every year. The advice it offers is timeless. Some of the most emphasized instructions are: use the active voice, be clear, save the time and effort of the reader. In the most decreed directive, omit needless words. In E.B. White's introduction to the 1979 edition, he provides a quote from Will Strunk that illustrates his obsession with omitting needless words. Strunk said, quote, "Vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences, for the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines and a machine no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all sentences short or avoid all detail and treat subjects only in outline, but that every word tell," end quote. Given my training, I think Strunk's advice is worth following. And lastly, writing is a process in which revision is constant, so start early. I suggest letting some time elapse before your last revision, at least a couple of days, so you can return to your writing with a fresh perspective. But don't be paralyzed by striving for perfection. Rarely, if ever, will you publish something that you believe is perfect. I have written some articles over the years that upon submission I thought were quite good, only to reread them years later wondering how I could have submitted such shoddy work. A few overarching principles. Produce writing that is enjoyable to read. This is the mantra of a close colleague of mine, and it's so true. Starting your piece with a brief anecdote or bit of humor can be an effective draw, but once captured, providing writing that is enjoyable to read will help maintain the reader to the end of your paper. Never marry your words. My undergraduate advisor was fond of this phrase. You need to maintain a business relationship with your writing. Words work for you. An editor will neither know nor care of the devotion you have for a particular phrase or sentence, no matter how witty you think it is, if that phrase or sentence just doesn't work. As you become a stronger writer, you will develop distance from your prose. This isn't to say that you should allow an editor to change your views. A good editor may help you find more vigorous ways of stating your opinions without altering them. But you need to recognize that editors are paid to be critical, and that good editors will improve your final product. Know your audience, and keep them in mind as you write. It's no different than if you are presenting a paper at a scholarly conference. You need to shape your talk to fit the audience. Your writing works the same way. This advice could manifest by the angle you choose for your paper or even the language you employ. Exercise your writing. The more you read, the better you'll write, and the more you write, the better you'll write. Your voice will develop, as will your confidence. In time, you will find it easier to articulate your thoughts and express your findings. You will become better conditioned in the writing process. A few words about collaborative writing. It is certainly harder than individual writing, but the end product is generally better. Why? Because collaborators provide more input. They can test each other's assumptions and build consensus, resulting in a stronger piece. My most recent publication was a collaborative one, and I have no doubt it was significantly broader in scope and stronger in content than it would have been had I drafted it alone. But it also took longer and required more energy, so there is a trade-off. With collaborative writing, you can divide the work, but someone needs to be the taskmaster and keep the group on track. Absent this, no one really will take ownership and deadlines can be missed. There are a few papers worse than those where you can feel the stylistic change from contributor to contributor. It's disruptive, like driving a stretch of road where every few miles you encounter a different type of pavement. To counteract this natural flaw, there needs to be an editorial leader, someone to smooth the transitions from contributor to contributor and to give the paper a single voice. First-time authors collaborating with a seasoned writer can be a great entree into publishing. So I'd advise seeking such an opportunity if possible. Just a brief word about copyright. To my mind, in this day and age, there's just no reason to sign an author agreement that surrenders your copyright to a publisher. Retain right to reuse your work, whether you want to post to your institutional repository or perhaps your blog. If your publisher refuses to budge on this issue, you should find another publisher. For your scholarship to have maximum impact, it should have maximum visibility. While publishing in a scholarly journal gives credibility to your scholarship, keeping your scholarship locked behind a paywall restricts access. Don't do it. I don't remember the last author contract I signed where I surrendered my rights in total, but I bet it had to be at least a decade ago. ALCTS's author agreement allows for the retention of copyright while giving ALCTS the non-exclusive right to distribute your work. It's a mutually beneficial agreement that is becoming more customary, largely due to the increasing array of open publication venues. ALCTS, for instance, is a green open access journal that allows its authors to post the finished PDF to a subject or institutional repository. I think ALCTS's adoption of this most liberal green policy benefits both author and ALCTS. The author gets to post the version of record, which is copy-edited, well-formed, and attractive. ALCTS, by virtue of having its ALCTS branded article freely available for review, draws more readers and attention. This is the kind of arrangement you should seek as an author. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware of open data initiatives required by funding agencies such as NSF and NIH. Relatedly, over the last few years, there has been a push in the social and biomedical sciences to make available data in computational code for replication purposes as a means of validating research. There have been an unfortunate number of cases where human error and at times malicious deception have invalidated research findings. I'm currently working with an economist at Haverford on a project funded by the Sloan Foundation to teach undergraduates good data management practices. While it's relatively easy to teach college students how to manage their data and accompanying files as part of their initial introduction to empirical research, it is far more difficult for seasoned social scientists to adopt these practices. Our hope is by teaching students to create work that can be easily and exactly replicated and to extend these principles to colleges around the country, transparent practices will bubble up to eventually become professional norms. At the same time, an increasing number of journals in the social sciences are requiring submission of data and code by authors, which is a good step forward, yet several challenges remain that I won't go into here. My point is simply this. If you conduct empirical research, make your data and statistical code available. In addition, provide a README file that describes exactly how you took the data and manipulated it. Doing so will both validate your work and provide opportunities for others to extend it, thereby increasing the impact of your scholarship. It's a habit to form early in one's career. There are several open source tools available to assist. The Center for Open Science at the University of Virginia has created the Open Science Framework, or OSF, a relatively lightweight tool where scholars can post materials and share them with collaborators and the public. Dataverse is the product of Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Science. Like OSF, Dataverse is an open source platform for managing digital objects. It has a rich metadata layer that is comprised of a combination of DDI and Dublin core elements, thereby making it exceptional for describing social science data. In our project at Haverford, we use these tools in conjunction with one another. More recently, Icpsr, the Social Science Research Center at the University of Michigan, has released Open Icpsr, which offers scholars a means of storing research data and associated files and having these discoverable on the larger Icpsr platform. Local institutional tools such as DSpace, Fedora, and Digital Commons can easily be adapted for this purpose as well. Final thoughts. There's no prescription for success. Writing is personal, and while there are grammatical rules and structural conventions to adhere to, the process from blank page to finished paper is different for everyone. Yet when you're starting out, having some guidance is better than trying to make it up as you go along, hence the suggestions I've offered. I hope some of them will work for you. And finally, write for ALCTS. As you'll learn tomorrow, ALCTS has a group of dedicated, talented editors and a variety of publishing outlets. Take advantage of this opportunity. I think you'll find the experience nurturing and fulfilling. I'm going to hand the program over to Kelly now. Again, I want to apologize for the technical difficulties. Thank you all for hanging in there during them, and I look forward to answering your questions at the end of Kelly's presentation.
Hello, and thank you, Norm, for what you shared. Some of what you talked about is something I'm going to dig into a little bit more. Go ahead and get this started. Okay, so a little bit about me. I am an editor and community manager for Book Riot, bookriot.com. And before that, I worked for 5 years as a teen and youth services public librarian. I worked at a number of different libraries in Wisconsin and Illinois in the public library. Last year, my first book was published called It Happens, A Guide to Contemporary Realistic Fiction for the YA Reader. And prior to that, I published a few articles in Voya magazine, as well as in School Library Journal and the Hornbook magazine. My very first article came, I think it was my second year of working in a public library. I had done a program with a school librarian in my community, and we thought, we came up with this great program idea, let's share it. And from there, I found huge value in writing for professional publication. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about organizing your writing. Whenever I sit down to work on a piece of writing, I think of 3 questions for why I'm working on a writing project. The first is, why am I writing it? Or, sorry, what am I writing? What is it that I want to get out of writing? What purpose will this writing serve? Most of the time, writing has multiple purposes. It's a way of developing your own knowledge through research, and it's the work of constructing a thesis or exploring an idea. And it's also a way to convey information to colleagues who may be looking for this sort of information now or who may be looking for it later. Once I've kind of identified what I want to write, I think about why I'm writing it. What purpose is it going to serve? Why do I want to sit down and spend time working on this and exploring an idea? And finally, when I've kind of thought about a what and a why, I think about who I'm writing it for. Is there a specific audience I want to write this for? And when I can identify who that audience is, it gives me a sense of the scope of the project. Am I going to be writing something that's perfect for an article? Am I going to be writing something that's better served as a blog post? Or am I looking at something that's going to be longer and might be best served through a longer project like a book? When I sit down and think about those 3 questions, the next thing I like to do is craft a pitch for what it is I'm going to write. And I use those 3 topics, the what, the why, and the who. And so I put up on my screen an example of a pitch I wrote for an article for School Library Journal. I had been blogging about horror and why, and it occurred to me that I hadn't seen a whole lot in the professional journals about horror in young adult fiction. I knew that School Library Journal did in-depth pieces on different genres periodically, and I knew it would reach a broad audience of teen libraries and public libraries as well as school libraries. So I wrote a pitch to the editor. I just went to their masthead and found out who the editor of School Library Journal was, and I wrote a very short and to-the-point pitch hitting the who, the what, and the why. My pitch introduced myself, my expertise, what it was I wanted to write about, why I wanted to write it, and who I thought the piece could be for. Since I was familiar with the publication, I also noted in the pitch what I thought the article would look like as an end result by referencing a piece I had published before. Following the email pitch, which as you can see was really short and really to the point, I got a phone call from the editor and we sat down and we hashed out firmer details, including a general outline, a word count, and a deadline. Sometimes when you write a pitch, you know those things up front. Other times it's best when you can sit down with an editor and sort of figure out what a best fit would be, what sort of deadline you're working on, what sort of length they're expecting. But writing a very short, to-the-point pitch hitting your who, your why, and your what gets those doors open and rolling for you. So organizing your writing. Like Norm, I'm a big fan of using an outline, and I think without an outline I would be a mess with writing anything. Everybody uses outlines differently. Some people like them very detailed, some people like very, very sparse outlines, but I know a lot of times when you do submit a piece of writing for publication, you're required to submit an outline. I suggest spending time making it and using the who, the why, and the what to guide the idea creation in the outline. So the book I wrote for Boya began as an article pitch about contemporary realistic YA, but as I sat down to outline the article itself, I realized it was way longer than 1,500 to 2,500 words, which was generally the article length for Boya. So I sat down and envisioned what a book might look like instead. Did I have enough material for it? How could I serve an audience in covering different angles within this very specific topic of YA fiction? Was it interesting enough for a much longer piece? And when I sat down and wrote the outline, I determined that it was worthwhile. When you're making an outline, you're also sort of creating a workflow for yourself. You can determine as best as you can how long it will take to work through each part of your outline. And when you do that, you can prioritize what you're working on. Personally, I find writing introductions to be really unhelpful to start a project, and I like to skip around when I write. So having an outline gives me tools to do that, so I can write out of order and still find some logical way to connect everything back together. When you write an outline, don't worry if it evolves or changes. Allow space for that flexibility. because sometimes you'll hit on a research topic, or you'll find an article that interests you that fits in the outline but wasn't there to begin with. So going back to that outline and being able to find a place where it might fit in very well is really useful. In writing my contemporary book, for example, I didn't think about talking about the topic of magical realism, but as I read more about it, I realized that fit really well in the book to at least have a sidebar in one of the chapters. And so while it wasn't the core of the book, it had a nice talk piece in it that still related and that I thought fit the overall theme of the book anyway. Likewise, sometimes you won't have everything you need to cover everything you want to cover when you're writing an article or a book. So let yourself have that space in your outline to edit those things out or to make notes for future research and future writing projects. Save new versions of your outline, redraft your outline, and let that be the structure that guides you through the process. Don't look at it as something that's static, but rather something that's elastic and that you work with throughout the entire process of writing. So 4-ish useful tools for organizing your writing. These are all free tools. Pocket is one that I find extremely useful in every kind of writing I do. It's just getpocket.com. It lets you bookmark, tag, save, and search anything around the internet. So if you're writing something and collecting different websites, you can put them in Pocket, you can credit them, and you can label them. So when I was writing my book, if I'd find a YA book that sounded like it would fit within a topic, I would label it within that topic. So I have a chapter on sports, I'd label it sports book. And then I can go into Pocket later and just search sports books and they all pop up. I found it easy to search that way and then gather them all in one spot. And it's a really good way to make sure that you have all your sources in one place so you can go back and credit them. Sketch is also a free tool, and that is screen capping. So there's more you can do in it with annotating and highlighting, but I find that just using it to capture information I want on a part of a website is really useful, and then you can save it and refer back to it later. It's more precise than sort of the built-in screen capping tools that you have on your computer. The biggest tool I find useful for writing is spreadsheets. As an outliner, I find spreadsheets allow me to move pieces of information around very nicely, and I find it really useful for indexing as well. So if you're writing something longer and you need to keep an index, a spreadsheet is going to help you out tremendously. I track keywords and themes. When I wrote the book, I put book titles in there and authors, which allowed me to organize and alphabetize and rearrange very easily. And then finally, just your basic analog tools. So your Post-it notes, your highlighters, your index cards, your notebooks, anything you can write down. Sometimes you have to write it down in order to get through a writer's block or to make sense of what you're working on. And those sorts of tools allow you to move things around physically and make quick notes to yourself when you're mid-writing or mid another project. And it's also a different way to think. When I get stuck, sometimes I like to just take a pile of papers and my notes and get away from a screen and look at things in a very tactile way. And that sort of gets ideas working for me when I can't get them to work when I'm staring at a screen. So Norm talked a little bit about analyzing data from research, and he comes from a background that is more quantitative than anything that I've written before. Most of what I've written has been qualitative work. But I think when you're working on qualitative work, you can break that down into quantitative data that's useful for you as a writer but might not necessarily come out in your writing for your readers. So if you're writing on a topic, it can be helpful to break down your research into data bits in a spreadsheet if you're trying to provide as much balanced information as possible. So I like to look at things like the backgrounds of the different authors I'm citing, the backgrounds of the different authors that I'm including in a book list, to see if I am representing a wide variety of voices and backgrounds. Do I have a good gender balance? Am I looking at work from people who are outside a majority culture? These are things that aren't going to show up in my writing, but they're things that as a writer I need to be aware of so that I can know if I need to do more research. Again, that's never going to show up to other people, but it's going to show up to me, and it's going to show up in my writing just by virtue of who I'm citing and who I'm not citing. When I wrote my book, I kept track of authors and main characters in terms of gender and diversity, which ended up being extremely helpful in organizing information and creating multiple indexes. It kind of showed me where my weaknesses were in my research, and I knew I needed to do more work to add more diversity to my own book, which forced me to read more diversely, which then allowed me to have more diverse voices show up in my book. It's not about filling quotas, but understanding that there's institutional biases that exist in our world, and there are ways we can work as writers to do the best we can by not falling into those biases. Use your what, your why, and your who to outline, in your outline, to guide your research. It can be overwhelming to put all your research together, especially if you're doing qualitative research and you've read article and article and article, you've read book and book and book. But if you think of those 3 key terms and 3 key reasons why you're writing in the first place, you can better figure out what research belongs and what research you can kind of put somewhere else. Which fits into the very last point here. Determine what needs to be used in your text and what can be put somewhere else. Sometimes you find interesting research or articles and they don't necessarily fill the purpose of your article. They don't fall neatly into your what, your why, or your who, but don't toss it. Save that stuff for bibliographies or back matter, or have it saved somewhere for an additional chapter or future project. We're information people as librarians, and we like information presented us in various forms too, since we all learn differently. So sometimes what might not translate into narrative might translate nicely into a sidebar or into a pie chart or into some sort of extra in your writing. If you keep a running file of this would make good other matter material when you're writing, you can present that to an editor often who would be happy to work with you on creating something more visual or offering some sort of additional features in your writing. When I wrote my book, I asked for sidebars throughout the research or throughout the chapters, and that helped break up the text a lot, and it allowed me to include some interesting things that didn't necessarily fit, but I knew readers would be interested in knowing about. And if you can't use it immediately, save that stuff for future projects. Sometimes the next great idea you have is something you pull from this research you're working on now. Finding time to write. If you sit down with your outline, make sure you're setting up deadlines and a workflow, and then you can have a pretty good idea of what your timeline is for the project. Will it take you a week of writing an hour a day? Will it take 6 months of being able to squeeze in 3 or 4 hours a week? Or will it take you a year of being able to write 1,000 words a week? Know your brain, know your obligations, and set up reasonable and realistic expectations of yourself. Some institutions give you time to write, and they'll let you count it as professional development, so find out if that's a possibility. The very first article I wrote, I asked if I could have time when I wasn't working the reference desk to write, and I was allowed to have a little time here and there, and I used that to write and to communicate with the person who was writing with me. And I found that to be really helpful because sometimes after a long day at work, the last thing I wanted to do was come home and write. I know some people have had luck blogging when they are working because it is part of their professional development. So sometimes you just have to ask and find out if that's a possibility. If you need time off work to work, make sure you make it a routine. Commit to your writing. It can be an hour before work, an hour after work, 3 solid hours on the weekend. Whatever it is, make it a routine that makes getting the work done easier. When you budget time in your outline, you can budget this writing time in as well. Use that dedicated writing time to write. If you are doing research and you come up with a question when you're writing, make note of that, but keep going in your writing. You can go back to those questions. When you give yourself time to write, you need to sit down and write. Otherwise, you can end up going down holes that don't necessarily get your work done. You can use the writing time for research, but you should also make that research time not writing time. Make them 2 separate things. I find a lot of times the mere act of making writing a routine makes it a thing that I look forward to. It's a break from the rest of my day when I'm working on other things. When I know, 4 o'clock hits and I can sit down for an hour and write from 4 to 5, it's something I end up looking forward to. It gets me through whatever it is I'm working on now. So pushing through writer's block, something I heard, and this must have been in high school, and it's something that's stuck with me since, is you can't edit a blank page. So don't beat yourself up if you are writing stuff that is, to you, just terrible. You can edit that, but you can't edit a page if it doesn't have any words on it whatsoever. Even if you just have to write bullet points with comment bubbles, noting you need to come back to flesh something out, that's fine. It's still writing. Use your budgeted time of writing to write, even if it is just bullet points at that point. If you make an outline, which you should make an outline, you're having a hard time with where you're at now, move on to something that you're looking forward to writing. I am a person who skips around. I'm a person who writes completely out of order. Even when I feel like I sit down and I spend an hour and I write 1,000 words in an hour and I'm really happy with what I've written, 99% of the time when I go back to look at it, it's out of order. It's not logical. It would make more sense if I moved paragraph 3 to paragraph 2. That's okay. It's still writing. I find the best part of writing is when you're done with a draft, you can go back and fill in those gaps. You can rearrange pieces. What matters is when you spend the time writing, you write. And with an outline, you make it easier to do a little bit of jumping around when you need to. Another strategy for getting through a writer's block is to talk it out. Even if it's to someone who has zero stake in your writing or somebody who doesn't know anything about your topic, sometimes the act of saying it out loud is what you need to do to get the knots out of your writing. I'll explain something to my husband, for example. He has no idea what I'm talking about, but by the time I've explained what it is I'm trying to do out loud, I figured out what it is I have to do. Sometimes you get so caught in your head that the mere act of saying it out loud somehow fixes the problem. If you talk to somebody who has experience with your topic or somebody who doesn't, sometimes they can also shed a light into what it is you're trying to say when you say it out loud to them. And finally, take a break if you have to and do something else that's creative. I personally don't believe in writer's block, but I do think that there's something as being burned out creatively. And you can be burned out on writing as well. And if that's the case, and it comes a lot of times when you've been working hard or aren't completely on your game and ready to write, pursue something else creative without pressuring yourself to write. Listen to music, watch a movie, play a video game. You can do something physical, take a walk, work out, get away from the writing and the words and the pressure you put on yourself to produce something and do something else. And oftentimes you can, again, unknot the problem. At Book Riot, one of the things we laugh about all the time is solutions to our problems come in the shower, and we take shower breaks. It's one of those things, it's like your brain is not actively trying to solve the problem, and by relaxing and not pressuring yourself to solve the problem gets solved. Working with collaborators. Set goals and expectations and deadlines when you work with a collaborator. When you sit down to make an outline, talk about who is going to cover what topic and how they're going to cover it. Are they going to do the research for it? Are they going to get in touch with somebody to interview for the piece? Break down your outline as you would for yourself, but assign people different tasks to do with it. Use collaborative tools when you're doing your work if possible before diving into it. Decide who's covering what. A shared doc at the same time can help you stitch everything together when you do have a final product, but it's also helpful to see where people are within their own process. Be flexible with deadlines. Sometimes stuff comes up when people are working together and you have to just give that space in case those issues come up that prevent meeting a deadline. I'm going to jump back to the collaborative tools there. I'm sure you're all using Google Docs. I find that that's the most useful and helpful and easiest collaborative tool to work with. If everybody has access to that document and to the outline, as well as they know what their expectations are, there are opportunities for people to lose or misplace important information when working on a project. I've written a couple of articles with other librarians before, and what we tend to do is we will use the very top of a document to be what we're currently working on, but when we have outlined or we've talked things out or we're trying to figure out answers to problems, we will put that at the bottom of a document. We'll have a line across the two of them. So we can always refer back to the issues we were having before. We can refer back to old drafts, and it's all within one document. And having that communication and having that back reference helps a lot. Hatching out those ideas together and seeing the edits and changes over the lifespan of a work really kind of gives you a sense of accomplishment when you see the final product. And it also lets you do what Norm had suggested, seeing where your voices are consistent, seeing where your voices are in need of a smoothing and a fine-tuning so that it all sounds like one cohesive voice rather than 3 or 4 stitched together. So then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about taking your blog to a published work. When you're blogging, the chances are that you're blogging about something you're passionate about. The further you blog and the more you talk about a topic you love, the more that you have to say about it, and the more you become an expert about that topic. Most of the articles I've written and the ideas I've come up with have emerged from the things I've been writing on my blog. They're things that have had tremendous feedback from readers, or they're things that when I've written about them, I found more and more information about them and wanted to dig into it a little bit further. If people who were connected with the piece on the blog were as connected as they were, I like to think that people who aren't necessarily connected to the blog world or aren't connected on social media would also find something worth reading in that piece. So that's why I could write a blog post on YA horror but still find a value in writing about it for a print publication as well. They're 2 different audiences, and while there might be some overlap, it hits 2 very different readerships. And it allows me to think in terms of a writer about that audience. I'm writing for 2 very different groups. I can mold and arrange and write in 2 different voices. And I find a lot of satisfaction in trying to talk about topics in different ways, in new ways, and it helps me gain a little bit of expertise in that realm as well. Again, go back to your what, your why, and your who. That's where you get your ideas. That's where you decide what from a blog could be taken to a published work. If you blog and are considering pitching for a book or an article, look through your analytics. See what it is that people are interested in your blog, and that should kind of guide you to thinking about what people might be interested in reading in an article or in a book. It can also be helpful in helping you figure out who the audience for that work might be. Your blog is your professional credential on a topic. When I showed my pitch for SLJ, I talked about my blog so that the editor could go quickly to it and see that, yes, this is something I've talked about before. I cite my sources. I kind of have an idea what I'm talking about. Well-written, coherent, and well-researched writing is obvious on a blog. Longevity, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily matter, and neither does the quantity of your blogs. Some of the best blogs I read publish once every couple of months, but it's something that's very in-depth, something that's clearly been well-researched. They don't have to have been around for 7, 8, 9 years. They don't have to publish every single day. What matters is the quality of their content. You just need a voice and a knowledge and a willingness to do it, to blog, and those are the same things that allow you then to pursue publication in other venues. Blogs show your passion, and that matters, and that passion is why it is you go after publishing. And as we can probably attest, at least I can, that's helped my career both in the public library and now outside the public library with interest in public libraries. So with that, I guess we can open up to questions.
Hi, can you all hear me?
I can.
Hi. So I'll go ahead and read a couple of questions to you and keep the questions coming. So we have a question about If either of you have suggestions for writing opportunities beyond the book review or the blog, and I imagine that might be a question about kind of dipping your toes into the water. And I did share a link to ALCTS publications venues, so if you have other ideas about how to get started in publishing, either specific ideas inside or outside of ALCTS.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I always suggest is look at what you're reading. What publications are you reading? What websites are you reading? What journals and books are you reading? And if your voice or your ideas sort of fit in there, look at their editorial pages and see what the process is to pitch them an article.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say. You know, really, as much as I hope that you'll consider ALCTS first, if the scope of what you're interested in doesn't fit there, each or many of the other ALA divisions have peer-reviewed journals. Those may be good outlets, and there's just a cadre of other open source and commercial library journals out there. But start with what you know, as Kelly suggested.
And a lot of the ALA divisions also have opportunities that aren't necessarily print. Like I believe it's the Public Library Association has a whole public library programming publication side that is just online. It's not print. And a lot of those things you can seek out by just spending some time on the ALA website and seeing what the different divisions are doing, what they have out there. You also, as well, they have a big, robust blog, and their blogging there is very good. And it's, you know, under the ALCTS banner, so it's quality professional writing.
Thanks, Norm and Kelly. And I'll just mention a couple of ALCTS examples explicitly. One is the ALCTS online newsletter, and the other is Z687, which is a series of white papers on technical services. And these are both great opportunities if you're looking as a first-time author. There's, I guess, a little bit less of a peer review process, and I'll say, as you'll meet the editors tomorrow, none of them bite. So I have a question here specifically for Kelly, which is, how did you find and grow your blog audience?
That's a good question. So I blog with another public librarian, Kimberly Francisco, and we started blogging together when I had finished graduate school. We'd gone to UT together, and we decided we were going to start this blog, and that was in 2009, I believe, and we just kept it consistent. For a while, we didn't have any plans. We just kind of wrote whenever we wanted to, and then we sat down. We decided, you know, we should have something 5 days a week. So we just wrote consistently. We wrote about different topics. A lot of times we will write just on things we're thinking about, or if we've read an article that interests us, we'll write something related to it. And we listen to what people are interested in, so we'll get ideas from readers sometimes, and I don't know how to explain how we've grown. We just stayed consistent, and we've always been really careful about making sure that we talk about a variety of different things, and we just, I don't know, we write what we're passionate about, and I think that has helped. I hope that answers the question. Being consistent and just writing what you care about.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I actually had a question for the both of you. You know, both of you had talked a bit about collaboration and finding collaborators. And Norm, you had mentioned that sometimes it's a good idea to pair with a seasoned contributor if you're new to writing for publication. Do either of you have tips for finding a good collaborator, both in terms of finding someone whose research interests are similar to yours, but also someone who's just good at being a collaborator, I guess?
The few times that I've mostly published solo, sort of taken the easy way out. Those times, though, that I have collaborated, it's with people with whom I work. If not here at Haverford, within our partner institutions at Bryn Mawr and Swarthmore College. And so they're known to me, and we understand each other's work habits and how we can rely on one another. One thing I should have said about collaboration, as I was thinking, as I was preparing my thoughts for this presentation, I was thinking back to when I first started publishing. I had few ideas and a lot of time, and now I find myself with a lot of ideas and very little time. And so it would behoove me to take a greater effort at trying to do more collaborative writing, because that really, even though there's more work involved for whoever kind of takes the leadership on that, it is a great way to sort of keep feeding your interests in sort of manageable chunks rather than needing to do soup to nuts in terms of writing something completely on your own. So, for me, again, I don't have a tremendous amount of experience working with collaborators, but I already had built-in trust before we entered into those publishing arrangements, so it made it a lot easier.
I guess I've collaborated with the same couple of people a few times, and I lucked out in that both of them had been previously published, so they knew what to do and they knew how to do it, and so I was the newbie to it. And having their experience really made it easier for me to understand the collaborative process, and we have that trust now. So that's a tough question, finding new people. I think you sometimes just find somebody who's writing on a topic that you're interested in and you reach out to them, or you are writing on something and don't necessarily have the expertise and you reach out for somebody who might have it, or ask for people to weigh in on an issue, and then go from there in terms of seeing whether it's something worth pursuing in an article or something book length. My collaborations have been for an article in the Horn book, and then for a book chapter which was on the same topic as the Horn book article. So we had a built-in, I guess, group knowledge of the issue, so it was more of the sitting down and mining that knowledge and making it presentable into a piece of writing.
Thanks to both of you. What are your views on finding collaborators at cocktail hour at ALA?
I love cocktail hour at ALA and anywhere. I don't know if that would be the most fruitful place to find collaborators, but thinking about publication, another great way to publish is to turn a presentation into a publication. It seems to many of us a lot less daunting spending 20 minutes talking about something than actually producing, let's say, a book chapter. But in fact, if you go to the effort of researching and preparing a presentation, some of that work is done. A good portion of that work is done, and so taking that and converting it into a publication may also help kind of grease the skids.
I'm nodding my head because that's where the idea for my book came. Is we did a panel presentation on realistic fiction, and I thought, we put so much work into researching this for an hour-long presentation. What can I do with this now? And so it occurred to me, like, maybe I should write about it. Maybe this reaches a different audience. People who can't be at this specific conference can seek out this information that the research has already been done for. So that's a really great suggestion. For the cocktail hour question, sometimes your best conversations do come up with somebody when you're, at those events, and you sit down and you have a good talk about whatever it is that interests you. And, I don't see why it would be an issue following up with whoever it is you're talking with afterward and seeing if there's something there worth writing about. I haven't done it personally, but I can see the value in it.
Thanks for entertaining my question, both of you. And I'll just second what both of you said about following up on a presentation. I I've found through presentations I've gotten so much good feedback, both people with additional suggestions after a presentation or people who said, no, you really should have included this or you really should have thought about this. And I feel like it's a great way early on to get feedback in the process too. We have another question here. Could we hear more about your specific individual writing processes?
Well, mine usually involves figuring out what the deadline is and writing an outline, and then waiting until the day before it's due to put everything together. I mean, I joke about it, but I'm very much a deadline-driven person, and as I was telling Norm when we were talking about this presentation, you know, I like to think. I'm very much a person who has to sit down and think about something for a long time before I can sit and write it. So I write every day, but I'm not necessarily writing about the same thing every day. I'm not necessarily writing every day on something that is ever going to see the light beyond, you know, my own computer screen and my own eyes. So if I have a deadline of January 13th, chances are I'm probably writing it the 10th or the 11th after thinking about it, after outlining it. I don't know beyond that what to say about process because I feel like mine is kind of scattered. And I write out of order, as I said. For me, it's very much getting it down on paper and then going back and editing. Going back and cutting things and moving things around and then having a final product. I'm not afraid to ask people questions or ask people for input. I'm very not married to my words. And that has been super helpful because sometimes somebody else reading it and saying, wow, this is terrible, is helpful for me. And it doesn't hurt. It just makes me a better writer.
I think I share Kelly's approach in terms of trying to get as much down on paper as, I don't want to say as quickly as possible, but to just go and to write. I mean, when I started writing, I was composing on, you know, with pen and paper. You know, I still remember having to sign up for lab time as an undergrad to work on the Mac 2E. So you never composed on screen. Everything was written out, edited, and then you would just type on the Mac. And you know, when I started on, I used to write, but it was just kind of like a brain dump. Try to get as much down as possible. Obviously, now I'm composing at the keyboard, but I work better if I'm able to just write and then go back and revise. And I revise a lot. I revise multiple times. I feel very strongly about the need to sort of let the writing sit and ferment and then kind of come back with a fresher perspective, because it's amazing how many times in my own writing I find things that are either out of place or don't really make sense or aren't clear that you just don't see at the time that you're putting it together. So I will say that over the years, writing has become easier for me. You know, starting out, I don't think it was necessarily writer's block, but it was harder to kind of get to that finished product than it is today. And I think that's just because I'm a stronger writer, having, you know, done this now for the last, you know, 20 years or so. You know, as I said earlier, I don't think there's really a prescription for success. Everyone's going to find their own way with it. For me, much like Kelly, it's just trying to get as much down as possible and then coming back and reorganizing and reworking.
I would say, you know, 70 to 80% of writing for me is rewriting and revising and editing. It's not the actual putting the first draft out. Once I get the first draft out, the real work is going back and editing and finessing and figuring out where the holes are and those spots where I put, come on, like put something here, like going back and actually putting something there.
That's comforting to hear, Kelly. I feel like I'm a terrible writer, but not so bad as a rewriter or an editor. So it's good to hear that's a common thing. I have another question here about submitting manuscripts to publishers or editors, specifically responding to publishers' comments and suggestions for revisions. Are there instances where you wouldn't choose to follow a reviewer or an editor's suggestions, or do you pretty much always do that?
It depends on the writing. there have been times that I've not followed a suggested edit, just because I think it makes more sense. But I would hope that through the process we've talked more than once, and whatever they bring up at that point is not something that surprises me. Or it's something, so a lot of times if there's something that I disagree with or that I don't know would make my writing stronger, I like to have a conversation about it. So how can I make this stronger? What isn't working here for you? And sometimes through the process of talking it out, I figure out a better way to say it, or I become much stronger in my, no, you know, I think it's right as it is. And it's okay to say that to an editor. But you have to maintain a dialogue with them so they understand why it is you don't want to make all those changes. Which makes me sound like I'm hard, you know, to work with, but no, I accept most changes. But there are times when I'm going to stick to my guns on something.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the way I go about it. I mean, certainly when it comes to the kinds of wordsmithing and copy editing, each journal has its own conventions, and I can't remember a case where I argued over the use of a particular term or, you know, mark of punctuation or whatever it may be. In terms of content, I would say there have been very few islands I've been willing to die on with respect to that. So, you know, and it's also a question of, you know, where you are in your career as well. You know, I would say if you're really trying to break through and get that first publication, you're going to be more likely to acquiesce and accept what an editor is suggesting. Again, remembering that the editor is trying to make your writing better. So, you know, you do want to keep that in mind. However, you know, if you felt strongly about something, you know, that would be something you need to talk to the editor about and explain to him or her why it is you worded something the way you did, or why you're expressing your views in a certain way. You know, when I was the book review editor for ALCTS, I tried very hard to make sure I wasn't altering the views of the contributors while at the same time trying really to strengthen their prose. So it can be a balance act, and that's not to say that editors don't make mistakes. You're going to get a chance, those of you who will be on tomorrow's session, to hear directly from some of the ALCTS editors as to how they go about working with authors over manuscripts. So that should be a great session.
And as you write more and you work with more editors, you start to develop relationships. If you work with the same editors over and over again, you develop relationships. But even when you're working with an editor for the first time, you know, I always think of it as having a relationship with them. Some are going to be more hands-on than others, but you kind of gauge that when you're pitching them an idea, and you can get a sense of whether they're going to be hands-on or they're going to be way more hands-off. You know, one of the best examples I can think of is for the Horn book article. I think we were all, this was a collaborative article, and we were all a little nervous to be writing for Roger Sutton. He had contacted us to write this piece, and you know, we were some librarians, and you know, but there was a suggestion that came from one of the editors that the three of us disagreed with, and we went back and forth for a long time saying, you know, do we have the right to say no? Like, what do we want to fight about? Like, do we feel right about making this change when, you know, we don't really think it's the right change? And so finally we approached and we said, hey, you know, here's what we were thinking when we wrote this. Here's what you said about it. Can we reach this compromise by doing this instead? And, you know, the editor is like, of course. You know, it's your piece of writing. This is a suggestion. Now that you've talked it out and explained it, it makes more sense what you were trying to do there. And I think having that dialogue with an editor is important. And I say that now as somebody who edits other people's writing. You know, I find the value in having an open communication about it, so it's not like surprise. And then people don't walk away feeling more confident about what they've written rather than, you know, feeling like they didn't do a great job, or that they, you know, they didn't meet expectations that they had set for themselves or that the editor had set for them.
Thanks, Kelly. That's really helpful. And we have a related question here that you somewhat addressed, but the question is, this person has published one article about 8 years ago, and at that time they got almost no contributions in the peer review process, in fact, they were told it was almost fine as it was. And the person is wondering, is this common? She says, I don't actually like this article much, so I wondered why there were no comments on peer review.
That's highly irregular and suspect, frankly. I mean, it hasn't been my experience at all on either side in the submission process or in the review process. So I would say that's very unusual.
I haven't done like an actual peer review piece kind of in that vein, but I know in my experience in working with editors, there's one editor I work with who never gives me any feedback at all, who publishes everything as is, and sometimes that stresses me out a lot because I want somebody to come back and give me suggestions or tell me that I'm wrong about something or that I should reconsider this point. And I don't know why this particular editor does that, but now having worked with them more than once, I kind of understand that that's going to be the way it is, and so I have to figure out whether I trust my own writing enough to go directly to them or if I need to seek feedback from other writers before I, submit a final piece to them.
Great, thanks to you both. We have another question here. What would you say is the average length of time you spend writing each article?
Oh, Kelly, you got to take that one. That's very hard.
It depends what it is. It depends how much I know about the subject. It depends how much research I have to do on the subject. It's hard to say. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I think each article kind of gives its own timeline. If I'm writing let's say I'm writing a 2,500 word article that's mostly going to be talking about books on a different theme, I have to spend the time looking those books up. I have to spend the time reading them. I don't know. 3 hours, 5 hours on something like that for the writing and the revising itself, not the research.
I would say another variable to consider is whether there's an empirical component to it. So to give you an example, we conducted a survey on ebooks here last February, almost a year ago now. And, I crunched the data and generated a, maybe 40 to 50 page report for the Haverford community on the results of this survey. That probably took me, 40 to 50 hours to do in terms of crunching the data, analyzing it, sort of making sense of it, putting it into a report that was clear enough for the community of faculty and students to read and absorb. On the other hand, if I were writing, let's say, 1,000-word op-ed type piece for a library magazine, depending on what the topic is, it might be an hour to bang that out, and then, the revision processes thereafter may take a little more time. So it's just so variable. It's a really difficult question to answer.
Thanks to both of you. I'm going to give a minute just in case there are any more questions from the group. And certainly if you have questions later, you're welcome to send them to me. I'll share my email here, and I'll pass them on to the presenters. But if there are no other questions for now, I want to thank Nora Medeiros and Kelly Jensen both for your engaging presentation on writing for publication today. I also want to thank all of our attendees. We hope to see you. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form, so please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. Your comments are really valuable and they help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future programming such as this. Information on all ALCTS webinars can be found on the ALCTS homepage. There are also a number of web courses you can sign up for, as well as our monthly e-forums. Suggestions for webinars and other continuing educational opportunities are welcome at any time. Please contact any member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee or submit a proposal for a webinar using the online form on the ALCTS webpage under Online Learning. Finally, I'd like to thank Julia Hess today for providing the technical support for today's session. The support she and her colleagues on the Technical Support Subcommittee provide make it possible for us to present this virtual symposium. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS events. For continuing education offerings, again, see the ALCTS website. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.